Hi Crossroads, I'm Joel, this is my beautiful wife Jody,
Hello.
and we are excited to be back with you. Hey, we're hearing amazing things about what's happening in our groups as we gather. Good job. We want to encourage you to keep coming, and we also want to encourage you to invite your friends. Maybe those who wouldn't necessarily come to church might come to these groups. So good job. Right now, what you are going to do in your groups is spend a little bit of time reading scripture. Now, there's 3 different passages for today. So you're going to decide as a group if you want to read those on your own all together, or if you want to read them just before the questions as we come up. So we've just read about Moses, and all it says the whole community of the Israelites arrived at this desert of Zin, and describes it as a waterless place. Now, I know that you spent some time in the desert growing up. Can you just give us a bit of a picture of what it's like to be in the desert, to be thirsty in the desert, just to be in that place of vulnerability?
Yeah, I grew up in this hodunk little town in Arizona where there wasn't anything around, so I can quite vividly imagine what it was like for the Israelites. It was so hot. We were quite poor, and so we had a trailer that was just like would heat up. It was like a little cooker. And yeah, my brother and I vividly remember my mom had these like little round basin tins that we would fill up with cold water and stick in the shade, and we would just kind of sit there. Yeah, and we had a cold water cooler thing that would create a bit of cool air in our trailer, but I just remember laying there at night just panting almost with the oppressive heat. And now when we go back to the desert, we kind of amble about the desert and we throw on air conditioning, but I can only imagine what it would be like without the reprieve from air conditioning, or their tents would have been sweltering. Yeah, because even here when you set up a tent in the summer, those things are like a little oven. So yeah, and we literally had tumbleweeds. Like, you know, you'd hear "ooh" like that country song, and then a tumbleweed come by. Yeah,
That's good. I think what happens when we're in these places where the environment around us is out of control is there's some kind of a response, a visceral response even within us. And I believe that's part of what's happening for these Israelites. And we're going to talk about their complaining coming up. But what I want you to do in your groups right now is what happens when the environment around you, and we're talking about a physical environment, but it could be a social environment, it could be some other type of environment. How do you respond when that environment is out of your control and it's uncomfortable and you don't want to be there? So go ahead and just discuss that in your groups. So you just discussed what it looks like to have a situation where it's outside of your control and your response to it. The Israelites, what they did was, in a sense, they sort of lost their mind, and they kept doing this, didn't they? They kept going back and complaining. They kept moving into this place of forgetting what God had done and moving to the bad desperate, the negative desperate. And that's what this whole series is getting to the good desperate, where we're drilled down to the one thing where our eyes are focused on Jesus. And what happens is normally Moses has been able to overcome that and stay in the good desperate, but somehow he gets pulled into what's happening with all the Israelites, all the complaining. God speaks this word to him. He says, "Go! I'm going to give your people water. Go and just speak to the rock, and I'll give you water." And Moses goes and he calls them this name, this rebellious, this stubborn people. And instead of speaking to the rock like God told him to, he strikes it, and he strikes it twice. And then God says this, because to Moses and Aaron, because you didn't trust me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them. So there's this lack of trust that Moses has towards God. There's this defiance rather than the good desperate. And there's this result, this consequence where Moses doesn't walk them in.
Yeah, that is a kind of a really sobering thought that just by not trusting God, that back in the Old Testament, they would experience such a dramatic consequence. So something to chat about with your group right now is there a decision in your past that you feel has given you this consequence, or that you feel has cost you the promised land? Because sometimes we confuse the Old Testament with the New Testament. And so, yeah, just take some time and hash that out. So in Luke 22:42, it reads, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." This is that good desperate, that we can approach the Father and ask him really raw questions about suffering and pain. And he is not going to smite us. We have that access.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I remember hearing this guy is a prof named Clowney. He talked about how Jesus was a better Moses, Jesus was a better David, and kind of explained the difference between Jesus and what he did and the way that he operated and moved as a human being. Because what we're hearing is Jesus in his humanity, not wanting to be nailed to a cross. Nobody wants to. But because of what he did, and here's the key, right? Because of what Jesus did, there's nothing that we do that hinders us from entering into the promised land. Right? So there's nothing that we can do that can stop that. That's the beauty of the work of Christ. And so what you're going to do in your groups right now is put a finger in, or somebody keep their finger in Exodus 3 and 4, and then somebody in Luke 22, and just do a little bit of comparing and contrasting between the way that Moses interacted with God. So God would ask Moses to do something, and then just read how Moses responded, and then look at the way that Jesus worked and moved through. And then just reflect on your life, on how God sometimes asks you to do something. What's your response? Maybe think about the earlier question about how do you respond in an uncontrolled environment. So go ahead in your groups right now and do those two things. Okay, so we are going to move into our last story for tonight's session on desperate versus defiant. And we find ourselves in John 12. And it's where Jesus is at Bethany. He's at the home of his friends, Lazarus and Martha and Mary. And Lazarus has been raised from the dead, and people are coming to see Jesus. They're coming to see Lazarus. And Mary does this thing where she takes expensive perfume, anoints him, Jesus, with oil on his feet and wipes with her hair. And then we hear the critique of Judas. So the groups that we've already read that. So just talk a little bit about Mary's desperate and defiant.
Yeah. Well, instantly what comes to mind is we talk about a strong-willed child and how one day they'll be used for like God's glory. And I think this is one of those times that clearly Mary is like her defiant nature comes out in a really positive way, in a desperate way, that she anoints her king. And back then, their feet when you would go to someone's house, they were often washed, and it was a very humbling task. It was the lowest job on the totem pole to wash someone's feet. And she goes right to a posture of humility in her desperation and anoints his feet and uses her own hair to mop it up. And there's this beautiful fragrance, and we're an essential oil culture, so everyone can imagine how the room would be permeated with this perfume and this act of humility. And ironically, it's the one with the heart that is in the wrong, oriented in the wrong direction, that points out her actual true beautiful act.
Yeah, exactly. And so Mary's desperation is a good desperate for Jesus. Her defiance is towards man or the humans around them, and saying, I'm not going to be afraid of what you think of me. I'm serving God. And Judas is the opposite, right? His defiance is towards worship, and his desperation is towards money. And so I think it's so easy for us to get trapped in these areas of a negative desperation and defiance towards worship when God gives us a task or calls us to something that's difficult, or it's time to lay down our lives to serve somebody, or to go out of our comfort zone to speak a word into somebody's life. And so what we want you to do in your groups right now is just to talk a little bit about the good desperate versus the bad desperate that you see in the story and that you see in your life, and the good defiance and the bad defiance that you see in the story and in your lives. So we've covered a lot of ground tonight. We've gone from seeing Moses in this place of defiance and it costing him entry into the promised land. We've seen Jesus in this place of desperation, but actually moving in surrender to God's will. And we see the contrast of Mary and Judas, right? Good desperate, bad desperate, good defiance, bad defiance. And so what we want to do right now is just make space for you in your groups to come around one another, really to surrender any ideas, any thought that a decision that you've made is holding you back. We want you to move into freedom because of what Jesus has done for us. We actually move towards freedom. How do we get there? We confess it, and so we speak it out. So it could be that in your groups right now, there's something that you're holding on to that you don't want anybody to know. And I want to encourage you, if you're not comfortable in the larger group, grab somebody just in a smaller group. Make sure you speak it out, and then you make space for God to do the healing and the freeing and the releasing. Because we live in a day now where we have access to the promised land. And so we're excited for you groups. We want you to keep pressing in. So just go ahead and move into prayer right now.